Okay, good morning. Thank you to all of you for coming to this, to participate in this session of Connect University, part of a series on disinformation. This is the second session on the subject. The first one was in October. As some of you know, you may have attended it. I'm very happy to be here, extremely honored to be replacing my Deputy Director General, Olivier Onidi, who is supposed to be moderating this session, but he has a decent excuse. He's in Australia on official business, so I was designated voluntary to do the moderation, which is a great honor. My name is Jorge Bento Silva. I'm policy coordinator in the Task Force Security Union. I'm a DG Home official, and at some point I will explain why I'm doing this. But before doing that, I would like to also welcome our colleagues who are in Luxembourg and will be participating in this discussion remotely, and of course the members of the general public throughout Europe and the world. It's a pleasure to have you with us to not only listen to how we figure out these things of disinformation, but actually contribute and ask questions. And the tougher the questions will be, the better the interaction will be as well. So thank you to all for coming. You have a remarkable panel in front of you with some of the best experts in the subject and experts coming from very different backgrounds. So perhaps a word before we start and pass the floor to those who actually know about the setup. How come we have colleagues here coming from the European External Action Service and from the Director General for Justice, together with a bloke who is supposed to be working on security, alongside our colleagues from Connect. Well, this basically boils down to what security is for us in Europe. The European paradigm of security is our own. It was not invented against anyone. It's not different for the sake of being different from the one of others, but it is based on the needs and experience we have developed in Europe over the last 60 years, 70 years. Europe won a lot of security challenges. We have been able to overcome them. On terrorism, we have been successful many times. ETA, Brigate Rose, Baader-Meinhof, on many areas of security, we have learned from our mistakes, and gradually we developed an understanding that you can actually have success if you do it in a particular way, if you approach security issues in a particular way. And the way we approach it is very simple. In Europe, security challenges are essentially met by law, under the law, through the rule of law, by empowering the legal profession, judiciary, prosecutors, judges, and so on. That's one part of the thing. So we don't wage war. We make sure that the rule of law works, and that is why we have DG Justice here. Then what they take is specifically on disinformation. Well, Panagopulos will develop that. We have learned as well that as long as we do it on our own in a secluded way, it won't work. Security is not something that you can establish borders on. The homeland security approach to security is not our own. It may work very well elsewhere, but here it doesn't. We know that security problems come from the inside, they come from the outside, they developed in a global way, they have local expressions, but they have a global context, and they can only be addressed effectively if we address them in a global perspective. As long as ETA could go and hide their money and weapons in France, or IRA could go and get their money from the United States, our member states dealing with those challenges would not be able to win over. So international cooperation has been fundamental in Europe, but Europe is not enough. and certainly not in when we are looking at the type of problem we are addressing today. And that is why Lutz Güllner is here, because a lot of what we are doing on disinformation can only be successfully done in the global context, in both bilateral interactions with countries like the United States, like Russia, like many others, who are close partners. They don't always see things exactly the way we do, and that is why he has a lot of work, and he will tell us about it. Obviously, the main characteristic of the European approach to security is that it is societal security. Security of a democracy will have to be a democratic security, and it will have to be a participative security. There is no way that it can be achieved by command, right? In other places, citizens will look at the Kremlin or the Communist Party of China to deliver security for them. In Europe, that's not how it's going to work. Security is the responsibility of mayors, it's the responsibility of parents, it's the responsibility of companies, and it's the responsibility of society as a whole. Now, DG Connect is the host here, and they are very much in the lead in these things. One of the reasons is because their activities, of course, today relate to a layer of human, economic, scientific, technological activity that permeates everything we do in our societies. But Connect is a relatively early comer into this security business. And contrary to others who developed 6 years ago and saw security essentially as costs, operation costs, whether you're talking about transport or energy, our colleagues from digital society look at security as a fundamental operating condition for the exercise for the functioning of digital society and digital economy. And so it just happens that they are right now, whether they perceive themselves or not to be in this position, at the focus, at the center of a lot that is happening in the security field, in this area of disinformation, like in many areas. When you're talking about hybrid, when you're talking about protection of elections, and Harry will mention that today, in many other fields, Connect is not only there because they have the necessary expertise to contribute, but they have a vision of security which is one of the public goods that has to be equated with other public goods, such as employment, competitiveness of our industry, and so on. So it's a privilege, Paolo, to be here today and to moderate this session. And without further ado, I would like to pass you the floor and ask you to introduce this discussion.
From here or from there?
Where you prefer.
No, from here.
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a second of a quite long series of events around the issue of disinformation. The issue of disinformation is indeed a topic that lends itself to be looked from different angles. You have already, for those who were present at the first section, you had already seen how this priority come within a more general set of action. You had already a contextual introduction to the issue of disinformation. Let me just recall one important point. If you talk today about disinformation, it's because of the drastic changes that have been occurring during the last 5-6 years in the overall media landscape. These changes are driven by changes in consumers' attitude, the fact that digital devices have become the main source of access for accessing information for most of citizens. It is certainly a key factor in the number of challenges that we are facing today, and these challenges concerns certainly disinformation, but also concern other forms of critical communications that overlap with criminal activities like incitement to violence, incitement to terrorism, incitement to hate, and cyberbullying. The data that we have collected through Eurostat are quite clear. At present, but the figures are moving quite fast. 69% of Europeans read news online. 69% of Europeans, and 62% are using social networks. The 75% of social media users declare to come across to disinformation at least once per week. And only 26% of Europeans declare to trust information that they access via social media. There is therefore a fundamental issue of trust that arises within the context of the digital transformation of the media landscape. By the way, 83% of Europeans think that disinformation is the threat for democracy in general. So that to give you a little bit of a picture of the perception that citizens have regarding the topic we are discussing today. And this issue of trust is trust in the media sector, trust in the traditional news industry. It is compounded by another concomitant factor, which is the shift in advertising revenues from the traditional media to the platforms. So at the core of the debate very often comes the question whether it is legitimate for platforms to base solely their business model on the use of the data that people provide consciously or unconsciously to the platform, which becomes a commodity, the fuel, the business model of the platforms, which in turn can develop techniques that are particularly impactful in addressing specific content to specific audiences, and then the whole issue around micro-targeting and use of social media and algorithmic directions for content comes into play in this context. On the other side of the fence, however, don't forget that there is the press, there is the broadcasters that are also, to a large extent, living out of the same revenues. And the question arises, therefore, how the competition between these two set of players can develop in the future in a fair manner, considering the advantages that online platforms have in terms of data collection and data exploitation over the traditional players. That is a long term, let's say, reflection. And of course, there are other departments in the Commission, in addition to those who are represented today here, that are also looking at this aspect, in particular DG competition. The topic we are discussing today is certainly a multifaceted phenomenon. Disinformation is a multifaceted phenomenon, and I hope you realize it as our discussion goes on during the morning. The first and the most obvious example of threats that arises from disinformation is given by the risks of foreign meddling in electoral processes. Much has been said, much is already known regarding the interference that foreign states, in particular the Kremlin, has exercised over critical electoral processes, be it the presidential elections in 2016 in the United States or the Brexit referendum. And I will not say much more because I think that Lutz has a lot of examples, interesting examples in this respect. However, foreign meddling in electoral process is one facet. There are other critical facets in this phenomenon. More and more we understand that disinformation is becoming a weapon, a useful strategic tool for domestically grown group that aims at muddling policy debates within our own member states by using divisive or sensitive topics like immigration, like health, like climate change or finance as themes that may be harnessed in order to artificially shape public opinion, and therefore to prepare the grounds for misguided choices when the electoral moment comes. So, in other terms, we are assisting these days from a move from direct attacks, particularly in the form of hacks and leaks during the electoral campaign. The example is the presidential elections in France in 2017, with the Macron leaks having given to us a very clear exemplification of what hacks and leaks can mean, what harm they can produce in the last moment of the campaign in terms of outcomes of the electoral process. But the indication is that from this type of techniques and strategies, we are assisting to a more upstream manipulation of the media space, of the information space, that aims exactly, as I said before, to artificially shape public opinion ahead of the elections, and using therefore sensitive topics to create divisions, to sow distrust in policy and in institutions as a means to promote narratives that may favor certain political actors at the later stage when the elections comes. There are also, the phenomenon is also very dynamic in terms of actors, vectors, techniques, methods used for manipulating public opinion. Techniques like clickbaiting, so using fake news in order to attract audience into websites that are there just for economic gains, to make profit out of advertising revenues. It is well known and it starts to be tackled. The malicious use of robots or fake accounts or fake engagements. It is also another technique that is aimed at amplifying narratives and stories online by creating the impression across audiences that certain narratives have a strong popular support, whereas they have not. The use of coordinated groups, so using hybrid techniques, using cyber mercenaries, so trolls factories, in combination with automated system, always with the objective to amplify and to disseminate certain stories as widely and as fast as possible, is another example of these evolving forms of manipulation of the media. We are facing also future challenges, of course, with the evolution of the AI and AI-driven technologies like synthetic media, also called deep fakes, where it will be very difficult in the future for any users to distinguish what is real, what is false, when they view videos of politicians that look alike the real politicians, but they're entirely synthetic in their production. The same goes for AI-generated text. It will be very difficult to see whether there is a human or a machine that produces text. And if there is a machine that produces text, you can imagine the impact and the spread that certain stories may have online. Then I mentioned already the critical point, which is the use of personal data for micro-targeting political messages, which is increasingly coming at the forefront, of the public debate. Yesterday I was present in Dublin. There was the third meeting of the International Grand Committee on Disinformation and Fake News. It's a committee that gathers parliamentarians from different countries around the world, from 10 countries, and there's a hearing. And this, essentially during this hearing, the questions coming from these parliamentarians were very much insisting on the legitimacy of using personal data for the purpose of micro-targeting political messages in particular. So that is certainly an issue that it is hot at this moment in time. Having said all that, please keep in mind that when we talk about disinformation, we talk about content and conducts which are harmful, but not necessarily illegal. So there is always a very thin dividing line between hate speech or incitement to terrorism and other forms of illegal conduct that may take place both online and offline, or sometimes with connection between the online and offline worlds, that are already being framed and already being tackled through legislative, including via legislative instruments. In the area of hate speech, for instance, there is not only a code of practice, but there is a framework at the EU level and national legislations as well that deal with hate speech. Takes the example of the German law. The Netzgesetz, thank you. So that's, and even in that context, a problem comes quite prominent in the reflection and as an issue for implementation of these rules, which is to what extent the protection of freedom of expression plays even in a context where the conduct or the content in question, it is illegal. You can imagine easily how difficult it is to strike the right balance when the issue that we have to deal with has not this criminal or penal connotation. So that the freedom of expression, the principle that should drive democratic societies in the first place, needs to be protected, although it is true that freedom of speech, it is not unlimited, it's not an absolute right. There are exceptions that can be introduced. The exception normally relies on the identification of conduct of contents that are illegal in nature. If that is not the case, of course, the prevalence goes to the protection of the fundamental human rights, where freedom of speech appears among those at the top of the list. Now, how to tackle this complex phenomenon and also cater for the need to preserve fundamental principle, it is precisely what the Commission has been, together with the External Service Action, been doing during the last couple of years, I would say. This work has culminated in the action plan, which was adopted in December. And this action plan, it is articulated along four main strands. The first two strands, I will leave it for Lutz to develop because it's really very much in your hands, Lutz, and concerns the strengthening of detection analytical capabilities at the institutional level, in particular within the stratcoms that operate within the External Action Service. And the second pillar is about facilitating a coordination between member states authorities, which so far have been acting in a very disparate and uncoordinated manner, in particular through the creation of a rapid alert system, the RIS, that should exactly facilitate exchange of information, best practices, and when the moment comes, to exchange alerts in case of possible threats. The third pillar, it is instead aiming at engaging the industry in the process. The multi-stakeholder engagement process is something that connotates the whole governance of Internet at the global level. And we apply the same principle here in the context of disinformation by engaging the platforms and to drive them to an outcome which has been the so-called code of practice against disinformation. That code of practice has been now in force for 12 months and aims at, let's say, channeling the policies that the signatories are required to implement towards five main objectives. The first objective is to exercise a much better scrutiny on the placement of ads, of commercial ads, to avoid that revenues from brands, the revenues from the advertising investments made by brands, do not flow to purveyors of disinformation, to imposter websites, to ad farms, to those actors that use fake news as a clickbait mechanism to attract viewers and advertising revenues. The second is about creating transparency around political and issue-based advertising. In particular, the signatories, in this case I'm referring to Facebook, Twitter and Google, have created political ad libraries that have enabled for the first time to look through the behavior of political advertisers during the European elections. They are not perfect. These ad libraries are far from being perfect, but enable some research, some independent research, and the identification of the sponsors, of the amount spent, and of the basic targeting criteria used by political advertisers when promoting their own campaigns. The third pillar of the code is about fighting conducts that harness the vulnerabilities of the platform services to amplify messages online. So I've been mentioning bots, I've been mentioning already fake accounts. The code is not complete probably in that respect because it does not expressly refer to other very spread practices like the use of fake engagements, the purchase and sale of likes, followers, often in the black market, that contributes to increase artificially the popularity of the stories and therefore to increase their findability online. On the other side, even if the code does not expressly cover it, the platforms, in particular Facebook, has been engaging in a very systematic, I would say, action to detect what they call CIBs, coordinated inauthentic behaviors. The CIBs are groups that may operate anywhere in the world and can target any country in the world. And the purpose is to create specific narratives that are then shared within that group and then further amplified through the use of the other techniques like bots and fake accounts. But at the basis, there are groups of individuals, humans, that coordinate their actions to achieve that goal. There are two other pillars of the code concerns the tools and means that the platforms should put in place to make consumers more aware and empower them by exposing different source of information around topics which are becoming trending. Thank you. And by surfacing authoritative content as opposed to popular content in their newsfeed or search results. All that presupposes, and I will conclude on this, and then I will very happy to complement during the question and answers time. All this presuppose, however, that the implementation of these policies is subject to a serious oversight. For the moment, we have been receiving self-assessment reports, intermediate reports from the platforms in the run-up to the election. Now, the self-assessment give an overview of what has been done during the last 12 months. We have published on the 29th of October with a preliminary analysis of the achievements so far. But what it is clearly crucial from the next step, from now onwards, it is to develop methods to exercise an independent oversight on the impact of these policies and also on the phenomenon of disinformation as a whole. That's the reason why we have launched a few weeks ago a call for tender, for procurement, to create a European Digital Media Observatory. The purpose is to connect together fact-checking organizations and academic institutions to have a much better organized community of multidisciplinary teams that look at the phenomenon of disinformation and can also benefit from a privacy-compliant access to the data that the platforms have and that are necessary in order to better understand both the phenomena and the impact of the policies that they have implemented to abide by the code principles. In fact, the fifth and the last pillar of the code is about obligation to disclose data to independent researchers. And that is a ground where much work still needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Amazing how you're able to give in a very simple way a perspective on such a complex issue. We could take one, maximum two questions at this point on what Paolo has said, but I would like either from our colleagues from Luxembourg, which we are seeing here, or from the room, but perhaps focusing on leaving to the side issues that will be addressed by Lutz and Hari. So, for instance, the dynamics of micro-targeting of message that has to do with the concept of free and fair elections, which others will develop, or the more generic issues of trust, for instance. Let's leave that for the later on. But if you have questions on the business model part, the mechanics, the mechanisms of disinformation, and the response, both in terms of the action plan and the code of conduct, perhaps more the code of conduct. We're very happy to take one or two questions at this point, and we can keep then the more horizontal issues for the time at the end, where we'll have probably half an hour for questions on the whole presentations. Any questions now? Luxembourg? Colleagues in the room? Please.
Thank you. In terms of response, did you already think about suggesting to intervene in the education of young people, especially children already? Because it seems impossible to tackle every problem at the level of the platforms. It would be also nice to educate the users of internet tools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I said I hope that there are questions that enable me to complement, that is exactly a question that gives me this opportunity. Media literacy, it is a fundamental pillar. In the action plan, there is the fourth area, which is about raising awareness and increasing resilience of our societies. That, of course, includes the strengthening of our actions in the area of media literacy. So far, media literacy has been looked at in a quite traditional fashion, meaning that it has been all the activities that have been carried out for now several years by the Commission in this area have been looking more at the education of young people in relation to the traditional media, how to read a newspaper, how to interpret the news that appears on TV, what are the methods of the working methods of broadcasters, and so on. More and more, it is felt that it is education has to also go much more in depth regarding the threats and the things to know about the working of dissemination of information, of news on the online space. We have not so far much resources available. We have been carrying on pilot projects with the Parliament, Media Literacy for All. It is a pilot project and now enters in the third year of activities. And these projects, we have around 10 projects ongoing right now, are increasingly focusing their activities on this information on the online space. So certainly this is very present in our mind. This year, for the first time, we have launched a Media Literacy Week, And the next year, between March and April, from the 30th to the 30th of March to the 5th of April the next year, there will be the second edition of the Media Literacy Week. Certainly, it is very much present in our mind, and we also hope that in the next multi-annual financial framework there will be adequate resources for this type of activity.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, a second question, please.
I didn't mean to ask, but since it was a very interesting question, I would like to draw on it and maybe give brief comment and ask the question, Ambassador Cesarino. So we raised the question to what extent it is education that should play a role in raising awareness among the younger generation. But I'm working for the Commission, but as a part of my community service, I do some teaching in the evenings. And I was surprised to see that most of my students are very well aware of these platforms, bots, etc. And what they were surprised about, it was their parents and grandparents who have limited media literacy, easily, well, become, objects and subjects and victims of this online propaganda. So the question here is, to what extent we should focus only on sort of younger generation, and to what extent maybe there is an action plan for focusing on people who have limited exposure and knowledge in media literacy or online media literacy in this regard. Thank you.
Yes, you are right. The most recent studies shows that the most vulnerable people are those below 24, I think, that is the group, and above 50. The pilot project supported by the European Parliament goes under the general name Media Literacy for all generations, for all ages. And that is clear that this direction needs to be pursued. How to do it is more difficult because one thing it is to address education in the school environment. Another thing is to get the message through population which are outside the school system. It's more difficult. I think that there is a need to develop specific strategies in that respect. One, it is already in place because as a part of the consumer empowerment commitments by the platforms, they are also committed to promote media literacy through their own services by addressing all users, irrespective of their own age. We need to do more. Probably one idea is to develop media literacy action through thematic areas. I explain myself. We know, for instance, that in the area of health, there is a lot of disinformation going around. We know that Google, it is used mainly, the search engine of Google, the most recurrent use is to look for information around health. Dr. Google has become the replacement for the general practitioner that people were used to visit. And the idea would be, therefore, to link up with communities that work within specific areas, like health, for instance, to develop action, information, or proper information actions with the communities that are directly linked to the services that they provide. Other themes could be, apart from health, could be in the area of immigration and in the area of climate change. Those sensitive issues I already mentioned before, you see. But that requires the gathering and the participation, the active participation of those service providers that operate in these sectors. One of the objectives through the Media Literacy Week is also to, to bring this up and to make it happen.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be other questions, but we can keep them for the final session where we'll have as well questions from the remote audience through the internet. I will now pass the floor to Lutz Güllner. He's the head of strategic communications in the European External Action Service. And the European External Action Service has a double take on this. On the one hand, it's of course responsible for multilateral and bilateral interactions with third countries and international organizations on this important subject, but it's also the entry point of knowledge for European institutions, including the European Commission. They have INSEN, they have SIAC, they have the means of bringing together diplomatic information from the delegations, information from the European services, internal and external services, and therefore they have our expertise on what the hell is going on out there. And Lutz is in this perfect position to, so he's in charge, obviously, of the first pillar, the detect pillar, but he also has responsibility of interacting with third countries, including those third countries which, to use Paulo Cesarini's words, conduct some foreign meddling, right? And this is perhaps interesting for the audience. Until a few years ago, we lived in a world where there were the like-minded and the others. And we had a lot of like-minded. Right now, things have evolved in a more traditional 19th century perspective, more realistic one, where most of our partners are both partners and antagonists, depending on the subject and the time and the period, and will have very complex relations with third countries and in international organizations where they participate. And very often we engage in productive interaction with exactly the same countries that are creating some of the most severe difficulties. And that is the fascinating task of Lutz Güllner. Please.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you for inviting me here. As Paulo already said, this is a very, very complex issue, very multifaceted, and maybe the key thing to keep in mind is always there is no easy analysis and there is no easy answer to these issues. Let me, however, try to be a bit complementary to what Paulo said and look at the external side of things and also what we do about this. And this is not only a complex and complicated issue, it's also a very delicate issue for all sorts of reasons that we have certainly in our discussion. Paolo already referred to the fine balance between freedom of speech on the one side, but on the other hand, legitimate concerns about either security or even stability of our societies. Yesterday, for example, I gave a presentation, or I had a long discussion with a group of journalists. And at the end of this discussion, the group was totally divided into two groups. The ones were accusing the European institutions of not doing enough. We should be doing much more. This is all not kind of sufficient. And the other ones saying, oh, you overstretch totally. You go far too far. You shouldn't be doing this. So you see just in this that we always need to find a little bit the balance here. I brought a short, oops, I hope that works. I don't know how I can do this. A short presentation, not so much to have everything, not to have everything on written also what I'm saying, but to give you a little bit of an illustration as well of a few things. Here is an example of a tweet in April 2018. The former British Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, tweeted, you can't read it, but it says, a component of the nerve agent used to poison Mr. Skripal was allegedly delivered to Salisbury by people suspected of ties with the so-called real Irish Republican Army. You can imagine that this is very, very delicate, that this is hyper-political, especially in a UK context. I don't need to explain to you. Can I just do a little straw poll here in the room? Who thinks this is a genuine tweet? Nobody. Okay, those of you who think this is a fake one, sorry, in Luxembourg as well. Those who think it's a fake one, why is it a fake one? Is there anything that you can see which makes you think this is a fake one? It's very difficult to see on this one, and there's no easy,
I think an English person would never make a statement like this so directly.
That could be one explanation. No, I mean, it's very difficult on this one. But if a British defense secretary puts a tweet and this is only 11 times retweeted, I don't know when this was taken, but 24 hours after, there's an indication that there must be something wrong, you know. So sometimes you need to be a real forensic mind, you know, to find what is wrong in these things. Sometimes it's the syntax, you know. There is an allegedly native speaker, and at least the three of us are not here on the panel. Sorry, Harry, you are more than we. And you make mistakes in the syntax. But if there is an allegedly native speaker, then there is a there shouldn't be these bizarre issues. The other thing is the frequency of tweets of certain people. Then you see all of a sudden there's a very, very stable kind of rhythm of tweeting, which is usually the indication for a bot or some automatism, or at least a sort of, you know, working hour related pattern as well. We have some tweets that are literally from 9 to 5 St. Petersburg times. So some of the things you really need to see. There's a lot of literature, and I'm not spending too much time in going through all this, but this is one of the examples. Sorry, I still don't know how I can go on. Andrea, can you help me? Here, good. Then the other thing is, why does it matter? You know, why are we actually concerned about all this disinformation? It's some kind of phenomenon in the net, etc. Maybe it has an impact, maybe not on elections. But there is a very famous case that some of you may know, and that is the Lisa case, and there are other cases, but this is the most famous. In 2016, I cut a long story short, there was a girl that disappeared, reappeared, claimed that it was abducted by migrants, and this kind of exploded in the net and was pushed and was the discussion that Germany is not safe anymore. Migration has led to the end of security and safety in Germany. Is that working? Sorry. And really, to cut a long story short, because it's really interesting to go into more of the details, but there were physical demonstrations, there was a dispute, or at least a discussion between the German foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister about this, accusing that Germans don't take the safety of their own citizens, in particular of Russian origin, not serious. And it turns out it was a total hoax, the whole thing. The hoax is not only the problem, but the fact that this exploded, so to say, in a social media debate, that this looked as if it's the number one issue, and that there was a clear kind of artificial amplification of this issue, that is what we are talking about. This is what the problem is. Good. So let's look a bit further. What is this, etc. I focus here on one player where we have evidence, where there's ample reports about this, and I have to say two things about this. The first one is, we know that it's not the only player. There are other players also. Can we measure, can we compare? That's already quite difficult. The second thing is, we know that the external dimension of disinformation, we'll come back also to that in our discussion, is certainly not the only one. That there's a very complex relationship between external, internal, that kind of these things are shifting. So don't misunderstand my presentation as saying this is all about one player, and there's one state that is trying to interfere in another state, and then kind of once we have addressed that, the issue is solved. That is not enough, of course. This is one aspect of a big, big, big pie that we need to look at. But we know from the Müller report, we know from a lot of the studies, of the research that has been done, what were the tactics used, what were the sources. And actually, my team, or the team in my division as well, the Stratcom task force, which is specifically tasked and looking into that, has amply documented this with cases, more than 6,500, nearly 7,000 cases of disinformation, which is very, very interesting, because it's not about the case itself, but about the patterns, you know. What is used there? How is it used? What are the tactics? What are the ways of doing that? And maybe I also have to say, interference from abroad is nothing new. This has happened for hundreds of years, at least for decades. But what is new is, of course, the way you can do this, not least with social media, but with many other digital kind of tools that you have. And an interesting cognitive element as well is while propaganda, as it was called decades ago, used to be kind of consumed by people relatively passively in the past, and now you can use it really to activate people as well, much more. So these mechanisms have changed. I don't go into all the details because I don't have the time, but I would just like to tell you what are the objectives, what are the ideas behind. One clear idea of this flow of disinformation is to distribute mistrust, to distribute distrust about democratic systems, about the way people are treated, about the feeling of fairness, about stability, etc. So this is just a small kind of glimpse into what kind of the narratives are that are used, and very, very sustained and very, let's say, also systematically are used. We are about to prepare what we call a handbook, which summarizes all these things and which we'll also put online on a website that you might know or might have heard, which is called the EU versus Disinformation, EU vs Disinfo website, where you find all these elements. I want to come back to something extremely important that Paolo mentioned, because this is whether you look inside, whether you look outside, because this is the crux of the matter, if you want. For us as public institutions, how do we react to that? And that is, what is the problem? What are we looking at, actually? Everybody understands something else by disinformation. Maybe some of you use even the term fake news. Some talk about misinformation. But for me, what is extremely important to highlight again, the point that Paolo said, there is a clear red line between what is illegal, which is a total different issue because we have laws, we have clear approaches. The issue that we're looking at here is something which we can use in a double negation. It's not illegal. It's not illegal. It doesn't make it legal, it doesn't make it nice, but it's not illegal. And that makes also our action, or the action of the European institutions or public institutions, quite tricky, because why should you tackle something that is not illegal? Or do you want to make it illegal? But on what basis? These are big questions. I know we don't have the time to go into all this. Paolo, Harry, and I, and Jorge, and many others are talking about this every day, every week. But this is something really you need to think through before kind of you jump to conclusions about what should be done, what should not be done. But I'm particularly, let's say, insisting on 2 points here on this slide, is that disinformation has a number of features as well, in particular if we look at the external side. And that is, it needs to be a clear intention behind. There's a lot of disinformation which is non-intentional. We have captured this in our definitions, that is clear, but it needs to be pretty clear, because we always get the question, yeah, but if you have an international broadcasting system in France or wherever, don't you do exactly the same? Well, there are very different intentions, there are very different parameters also behind kind of legitimate information and what I would call illegitimate disinformation. So there's a clear intention to deceive, there's a clear intention to kind of put out this distrust. And most important for me is this element of coordination. There is a coordinated effort of a number of actors that are somewhere either centrally or decentrally coordinated. So this is not a homegrown, this is not an organic community. There is a tactic behind. And this is extremely important when you want to capture this issue. And of course, what Paolo said, it needs to cause harm, it needs to mislead the public. So the term that I like very much, I know there is still a discussion whether we should go into that direction, but is this manipulative interference. Really, it's the fact that people manipulate. And in our discussion, we can come back to what can we actually regulate, if anything. Can you regulate content? Very tricky, huh? Very tricky, because you get into what is true, what is not true, or especially if you are in the not illegal part. Can you regulate actors? Then you need to kind of have actors on some blacklist. So that's why the best way is to look at the behavior of players, and that's exactly what Paolo was talking about. And just come back to the complexity of things. I really jump through because I don't want to take too much of your time. We from the External Action Service look at it as a hybrid, as an external, as a security threat as well. But of course, this is a much more complex kind of issue that you can address from a media policy perspective or digital, as Paolo and his colleagues are doing. You can come from a democracy and protecting elections, as Harry and his colleagues are doing. You can also look at it from a cyber perspective that Jorge and his colleagues are doing. That's why we're also sitting here in front of you to show that this needs a holistic approach there. The action plan. Paolo talked already about the 4 pillars. Let me just say a few words about the first and the second pillar, a bit more not in detail, but the first pillar is a very simple one. And that says, if we don't understand the issue ourselves, if we don't have our own analysis, if we don't know what's going on, then we cannot act, actually. So this is a lot of investment into understanding the issue. How is it manifesting itself? What are the players? What is the harm caused, etc. Of course, this is a steady investment. This is something that needs time, needs also cooperation. But this is also not an aim in itself, so that we just have this insight and then sit on it, but this is also to show what is going on. So that's why we call it to detect, analyze, and expose the disinformation. This is what we are doing a lot with pro-Kremlin disinformation, and where we're expanding based on the action plan also to other things that we are seeing. The second pillar is a relatively straightforward one, is the international cooperation on this one. Jorge talked about this. This is nothing that a member state or the European institutions can solve themselves in their little whatever, in their little corner. This needs a much broader coordination and cooperation as well. And just to mention a few points here, the one organization that has this really high on its agenda is the G7 as well. I've established a rapid reaction mechanism. There has been a long discussion about how to protect democracy. And this is a partner with whom we are trying to work very closely, not least because there are some partners in there, like Canada, for example, that have different threats, that have different situations, and where we can learn from each other to understand the issue and to develop, let's say, necessary responses. Let me jump to the last slide, just to broaden a little bit without taking anything away from Harry, I hope, but just to keep a little bit the trends in mind. We see a trend that there is less and less classic state interference, state A into state B, which we can trace and which we can attribute to state actors as well. There is a what do we call a domestication or nationalization or whatever you would call it. Anyway, a shift to local actors which are active, sometimes on behalf, sometimes in the same vein and the same spirit. But we see this shift, and of course there is an issue about if you look at it, is this still a hybrid threat then? Is this something else? Is this a normal national political issue? So which opens a range of questions. The second one is changes also in the technology. So while we saw a lot of bots still in 2016 that were relatively easy to detect, even for lay people, as I think most of us are. So bizarre handle whatever QRC1243, no followers, but following kind of 5,000 people and tweeting kind of 80 messages an hour. That was easy to detect. And at the time there was a very simple kind of formula. Freedom of speech for people, but no freedom of speech for automated bots. And everybody would have, well, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people would have subscribed to this. The problem is now that technology allows for so-called cyborgs, for so-called real people with real accounts, but new means to spread and to multiply and to manipulate also with this multiplication factor. We see also shift. Maybe not that clear yet, but that can happen quickly to other platforms, to other players, maybe even into other systems. And the big question that we are also with Paolo and colleagues and many others are asking is, if we focus now so much on Facebook and Twitter, that's correct. But what about in 2 years' time? What about in 5 years' time? Is this still the place where this will happen? We don't know. Big question mark. Will it go into closed messaging systems? Deepfake, so we have new forms of disinformation. And then, of course, one thing that remains a big, let's say, open construction side is how exactly does the impact work? So how is disinformation translated into action on the citizen side or on elections, for example? Thank you.
Fascinating. My apologies on behalf of Lutz and the panel to any colleague in anyone in St. Petersburg whose family life work balance is going to be disrupted by the announcement that we know about the 9 to 5, and therefore you'll be asked to work night hours in the near future. Before passing the floor to Harry, I'm sure Lutz will be happy to answer one question from the audience, please.
Thank you. Very interesting. I have actually a question on the last point you made, the impact. Do you have any knowledge of what the actual impact of all this disinformation and misinformation is? I mean, there are all kinds of rumors, elections, but has it been analyzed? And what is the real impact of it?
I mean, this is a question for all of us, and since we're dealing with this all the time, but there is no authoritative kind of simple way at the moment of saying if this is happening, this is the consequence of it. And you know the debate about how big is the impact in specific elections, in votes, etc. You see the debate ongoing in the UK at the moment. But I would warn to push either to the one extreme or the other, that this is all kind of has nothing to do and kind of why are you busy with this because there's no impact at all, or saying this is per se the end of any of our human interaction. So I guess it will be somewhere in the middle. A lot of research is happening in this field at the moment. It needs to go to the level of cognitive biases as well. Because this is also how disinformation works, and maybe also to link what we are doing. The request and the demand on the social media platforms to open their, let's say, or to be open to research is exactly because of that. Because we need to understand what are the mechanisms, what are the instruments used to manipulate exactly then what comes out at the end.
If I may perhaps make two comments. One on that, it's totally in line with what Lutz has said, but it's this notion of very specifically targeted impact. The mechanics is that you, with access to mass amounts of data, extremely sophisticated algorithms, you can determine what are the vulnerable voters or the vulnerable people in the tipping points of a electoral system, yes, and target exactly the type of message that these people, because of their consumption patterns and so on, will be vulnerable to, with a view to have not a massive effect in terms of the overall results of an election, but of the results in tipping point constituencies by means of affecting specific groups of people. It is alleged that in the Brexit referendum, associations of former military persons, so people of old age with a lot of credibility because of their services, were guided to deliver certain type of messages to certain doors. And there, if this is the case, you could have very specific effects, and it's not just internet. It's then the human contact, the age group, and all the rest. So the impacts should not be measured just in terms of overwhelming numbers, but of the very specific engineering that is put in place to have, with small effect, enormous overall impacts. The second element that I would like to mention is that where disinformation starts and meddling ends in my area, which is counterterrorism, and this goes into the notion of also what is legal and what is relevant, right? It is relatively peaceful in the academic community that studies these things, and the data that I have seen from other sources is not incompatible. That the investment done by countries in the Arabic Peninsula in framing the mind of European citizens over the last 5 decades has been in the order of 1.8 billion a year. 1.8 billion a year. That is more than the investment by all our countries in all democratic processes since the Second World War. Right? This is not illegal. Neither the financing was illegal. It was not disinformation. It was the promotion of a certain worldview, which happened to be contrary to the guarantees of all our constitutions on gender and many other issues. But it is not illegal. But it is relevant. It's relevant for the functioning of our society. It is relevant for the rights of individual groups. It is relevant for the functioning of our democracy, and it has been very relevant to create the conditions under which 14-year-old girls from 10 kilometers away from here ended up in Syria. So it is not irrelevant from the vantage point of security policy. In fact, we know that in order to win over ETA, you have to put the bad guys in jail, you have to put the ones that get the money and the weapons in jail, you have to put the ones that give them the political guidance in jail, but you have to address the 270,000 people who vote Eri Batazuna, and they are not criminals, they are not committing any crime. But they are creating the social conditions under which the problem develops. And without addressing them, you cannot solve the problem. So saying that because something is not a crime should not be the object of strong commitment is contrary to all what we have learned in Europe over the last 7 decades, that you prevent crime. You don't address only the one that is committed. So crime prevention is a guiding principle in all our legal approaches to this. But secondly, the fact that something is not illegal means that it should not be addressed by legal means, but it does not mean that it should not be addressed. Sorry for Paolo, please.
An additional information, your question is very, very relevant.
Yeah, it is.
It's very relevant. And indeed, we know very little so far. The reason that we want to stimulate research, Lutz has just recorded, it is also to understand better the actual impact of disinformation as a phenomenon on public opinion. There are several studies, a bit fragmented. One conducted in the United States look at the level of the loss of middle ground in Europe. Particularly evident was the case of the Netherlands, where the middle ground, so the people that are undecided, the people that are more prone to go to one or another extreme, it is actually reducing quite fast and is combined with the development of these new technologies. So there is an inductive correlation between the phenomenon, but there is no causality yet established. Another type of study, it comes from Walter Quattrociocchi from the University of Venice, is elaborating what he calls a polarization index. So to identify areas where polarization appears to be particular evidence, so the division, the tribalism online, the division between groups online, particular evidence, and correlate that index with the presence of disinformation in those particular groups. And apparently there is a positive correlation in this study that has carried out, but again, no causalities, there are always indirect evidence. That is where we are.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I will now pass the floor to Harry Panagopulos from DG Just. Once again, DG Just has a multiple role to play in this regard. the essence is that all these attacks are attacks on our fundamental rights and our values. And I was talking about security because that's my background, but let's be clear about it. Security is not a value. Security is as a right. Security is an enabling condition for people to exercise many other rights. It is not a right in itself, and it should be perceived as that. What is in question here, however, is the whole functioning of our democratic systems. The purpose, as we have seen, is to undermine the trust between citizens and their governments, the trust in democratic institutions, to actually polarize society and to act. I mean, I don't know why St. Petersburg is so concerned with sexual orientation in their disinformation efforts. Perhaps one could speculate about the reasons for their obsession with homosexuality, but the fact of the matter is that it aims as well to attack specific groups of people in our society, undermine the exercise of gender rights, the rights of orientation, many others. And for all those reasons, DG Just is extremely active on this and many others. Harry, please.
Thank you, Jorge. And it's particularly, I think, appropriate to be picking up on this discussion from the earlier question on the impact, because, I mean, essentially what I'm going to be talking to you today is about how we apply this concept of disinformation and responding to disinformation to a very particular part of our system, our society, the system of democracy. And what I would say is that although I completely agree with everything that's been said so far, it's not possible to establish causality at this stage. What you can say, especially when you look at the efforts that have been made to interfere in democratic elections, in a broad sense, so not just by means of disinformation, but through targeted hate speech and various other campaigns, which I will touch upon in what I explain, you can see, firstly, that there's been an impact on the debate, and there's certainly been an impact on the way that people feel about participating in politics. This is something that can be observed quite generally around the European Union and outside of the European Union. And whilst there is also a lot of research going on, it's also evident in the willingness of people to participate in politics and the treatment that they're subjected to when they do. Another thing which is worth reflecting on is that the overall impact of disinformation and such efforts to interfere in elections has produced a palpable decline in the sense of trust that citizens have in the institutions that are being targeted. So the institution of a democratic election, the processes, and this is essentially, the better part of half of the objective of sowing disinformation. I mean, you may wish to favor a narrative that favors a particular candidate, but it is far more effective in certain cases to simply create situations where people are disinclined to vote because they don't think that it makes any difference. They don't think that it's worth doing. And this is why, so over the last 18 months or so, we've been working very closely with member states to essentially enhance the cooperation that we had built with them over the last few years. It's probably a good idea for me to sort of pause for a second and just explain that obviously democratic elections is a very sort of sensitive issue for the member states. It's something that member states administrate for themselves. It's each member state has its own democratic traditions and ways of doing things. And even when you bring together all these traditions in order to run a European election, it is absolutely in the hands of the member states how they organize themselves and how they conduct the elections. However, there is a long-standing commission action in this area, particularly because mobile EU citizens that live outside of their member states of nationality, have the right to vote in European elections, they have the right to vote in local elections, and there's a number of directives that exist in order to facilitate those rights. We've been meeting with the member states for better part of 15 years now to make sure that these rights are sort of implemented in the right way, and to make sure that citizens participate, and to promote the participation of citizens in democratic elections through funding programs and through these discussions that we have. Now, in April 2018, following up on a communication and recommendation that we issued to the member states on the efficient conduct of the European elections, we met and discussed what was going on in the sort of electoral context more broadly, picking up on the issue of disinformation, picking up on the issue of cyber attacks, as well as the general aim of promoting participation. And what was clear to us was that member states and the union institutions were playing catch up with the way that things were evolving. I mean, when you looked at the gradually unfolding scandals that were affecting some elections, it was clear that whilst we had laws and processes and procedures in the electoral area, in some cases we weren't reaching into the online world sufficiently, or we weren't talking to each other sufficiently. It's something that became sort of particularly starkly clear in the Cambridge Analytica incident, where, of course, what that basically centres on is something that was illegal. It was basically theft of personal information, which was then later misused in order to target messages to citizens in order to influence the outcome of various elections. The trick was, I mean, when you looked at how this was dealt with in the UK case, for example, whilst the data protection incident was being dealt with by the Information Commissioner's Office, the Electoral Commission in the UK was not aware of what was going on, and was then later on felt unable to take sort of immediate action of the kind that would have been, might have been helpful to address it. And this sort of disconnect was something that we felt was very important to address. Applying the approach that Lutz and Jorge have described to the overall action plan, what we did was essentially to come up with a package of measures to secure free and fair elections in May, but in general, considering free and fair elections in Europe. And we put it together over the summer of 2018, and we issued it in September. The principles behind it were that we were taking comprehensive approach to the measures that we were proposing to the member states. This means that you were making use of the existing toolbox, of which there are many instruments that can be applied in elections to respond to disinformation and other threats. That it was a whole society approach that we were aiming for, something that could be coordinated through governments, but also through the EU institutions, that would involve civil society, the media and other stakeholders, most particularly political parties, which of course is yet another highly sensitive area for us to deal with, and something that we needed to be very careful about. And also, of course, owing to this sensitivity, that everything that we did would be rooted in respect for our European values. There's democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights, including most particularly the freedom of association and freedom of speech, but also the right to a free election by direct and universal suffrage, which is guaranteed by our treaties. Central to that is promotion of the notion of transparency, which runs through the electoral package. And an approach which is less concerned so much with the content and precise methodology of whatever threat that we're dealing with, and more to do with ensuring that the administrative system that the member states have in place and that we have in place is resilient and able to inspire confidence and trust in what we're doing. Just to sort of give you a little bit of detail on the precise content of the elections package, there was a communication which set out the main issues that we were looking at the time. There was a recommendation which I'll go into a bit more detail because the recommendation is the meat of some of what we're going to be talking about today. And we also issued guidance on the correct application of EU data protection law in an electoral context, which is, of course, crucial because it's a hard law tool that we can use and that gives us a reach into a lot of the activity that it allows us to reach into one of the main mechanisms that is used in order to amplify and disseminate disinformation. So and we'll come back to the idea of micro-targeting and targeting information, but where targeting is done essentially by using your behavioral data that you give to a social media platform in exchange for using its services. And this data can then be used by them for whatever purposes they've described to you, but they are also deriving from your behavior characteristics which can then be used to target, soap adverts and other product adverts. But it is also used, as colleagues have already mentioned, to target political messages. And the essence of our guidance is that there are all actors in political campaigning, including the platforms, but also including political parties and campaigners and data brokers and everyone, have to actually follow quite a lot of rules, and that it's an ongoing process with the regulators to make sure that all of those rules are enforced well. We also took action at a European level to make sure that the misuse of a breach of data protection rules could be actioned with European political parties, which rely on the European level for their funding. Now, to move on to the substance of our recommendation, it was based around cooperation, transparency, ensuring that the member states themselves cooperated at European level, but also at a national level, and took steps to promote transparency, cybersecurity, monitoring and enforcement of existing electoral rules, and that they were taking steps to raise awareness among the general public, but also particular groups. In order to achieve this, we asked member states to establish networks at a national level. So basically, what I'm describing to you is the plumbing that we used to promote the response. Networks of authorities that were responsible for various aspects of the democratic process, the electoral process. So this is electoral commissions, but also data regulators, media regulators. In some instances, in some member states, it also included competition authorities, the human rights institutes, to come together and discuss preparations for elections, to discuss the monitoring and implementation of the relevant rules, and to exchange good practices nationally. The aim was to make sure that coordination among these authorities would be efficient and swift, and be able to take action, and also to be able to reach into the online world, to be able to enforce what rules we have, to make sure that the issue of disinformation and other forms of interference was minimized. At the same time, of course, in order to facilitate exchange of good practices at a European level, we also invited all of these national networks to come together at a European level to exchange what they're learning and to form links with each other so that what good collaboration is going on at a national level is also replicated at the European level. Our network at a European level met 3 times before the elections, and I'll mention a few of the things that they talked about, and then once more after the European elections to sort of do a bit of a wash-up, and we'll be continuing to meet and exchange practices over the next few years. What we know from the national networks is that, and I suppose I should say that we're responding in this sense to more general issues with elections than simply disinformation. But the steps that you take are applicable to more than one thing. But at the national level, the member states, in quite a lot of instances, organized risk analysis activities in order to sort of test themselves, test their cybersecurity, test their preparedness, test how well they were communicating internally, and to sort of gain through all the various things that can affect an election. They took steps to coordinate the security measures that they were taking nationally, and they also conducted targeted awareness-raising campaigns. And these were, in addition to certain campaigns which sort of publicly focused and said things such as, reminding citizens to think about what they were receiving online in order to sensitize people about disinformation, and also, in a sense, just to raise awareness of the fact that the national governments were alive to the issues that elections confront, and that they were taking effective steps to make sure that citizens could have confidence in what was going on. They also provided training for political actors, such as political candidates, political parties, journalists, to ensure that they're aware of how to sort of appropriately respond to these challenges, and also that they understand the cutting edge of what we know. We replicated this at a European level. We had our own European cooperation exercise on cybersecurity. We exchanged the practices that were ongoing in the member states, and we also invited the European institutions, including Lutz and Paolo, to explain what we were doing in the domain of disinformation, and the RAS joined us on a couple of occasions in order to promote their work, the RAS being the rapid alert system that was described earlier. And we were also joined by representatives from the European Parliament, who described the communications efforts that were being made by the Parliament and the Commission to prepare for the European elections, to make sure that people had good information in order that they could work out how it is to vote. Because one of the challenges we face is the question of disinformation simply targeting people's knowledge of what formalities they need to go through in order to exercise their right to vote. And I think it's fair to say that we managed to cover quite a broad range of subjects, but in doing so, we do have a lot of work still to do in order to get into the depth of how to operationalize some of the things that we want, and how to sort of go forward after the European elections, and provides more specific interventions for our participants. Just to wrap up, one of the things that we will be doing in order to inform our future plans and the development of this network is that the Commission typically reports on the conduct of European elections. It will certainly be reporting on the conduct of the May elections. We expect this to be by the end of this year. And we will be looking at yeah, it's a moving target, Lutz. And we will be we'll be setting out our key findings, including on the efforts that the European institutions took and the member states took in order to respond to disinformation.
Thank you very much, Harry. But I mean, can you give us a hint about the main direction of the findings? I mean, the fact is that abstention went down throughout most of Europe. And although there were proven attempts to throw disinformation at us, the democratic process at European level did not crumble contrary to expectations and intentions from third parties, not only on this side of the Atlantic but also elsewhere. So it didn't go so bad as all that, right?
Not at all. No, it didn't go badly. And indeed, yes, participation was the highest in a generation. And in most member states, participation went up. Of course, it did go down in a few places. And there are certain details that we can look at which are sort of a little bit less satisfactory. And all on, I would say, along the lines of the theme of confidence and trust. And so as not to preempt the report, which I don't have yet, what I can reflect on is that it was quite striking to look at a Eurobarometer that we conducted in the run-up to the European elections, which showed that whilst citizens were more or less okay with how they felt about the democratic system in the EU, there were some striking examples of member states where citizens did not have confidence in their free media, which was, it is one of those things where you get the sense that there is an impact to the discussion. And perhaps we're just being over successful and raising too much awareness of a phenomenon that is not actually having an impact in the end result. But it will take a long time to be able to come to a complete conclusion on that, not least because the investigations that go into looking at some of the sort of key indicators of an impact, such as a data protection incident, or where foreign funding is being investigated by an electoral commission or the funding of a political campaign. The forensic exercise that is involved in this can take several years, and it's certainly far too early to conclude on those things.
Thank you ever so much. We have about 20 minutes to go. Let's we have also some questions that have started arriving from the internet. So I will try and bring some from there and some from the room. Perhaps one question that we have from one of our viewers in the internet that asks, can we simply use tagging to highlight whether an account has in the past created video manipulations, half-truths, intimidation, or false profiles? And I would address that to Lutz with perhaps going a little bit broader. Is there a way towards having a univocous and consensually accepted format for certification of origin in terms of news? We have processes of review that are now being put in place by individual platforms. But what the author of the question was asking is, can we actually tag the liars and say don't trust this source?
The answer is it depends who will do this. You know, if this is a government deciding on whether this is a website which is good or bad, etc., we come into on a very slippery slope, and that's why the approach that also Paolo and Harry indicated from our side is we need to empower civil society, we need to empower the profession, we need to empower the professional organizations, journalists, etc. There is, just to give you one example, there are a couple of these initiatives of creating kind of a traffic light system for this type of website, which is good. It's certainly not sufficient, but it's good. But again, it needs to be pretty clear on what basis and what legitimacy this has been done. So come back to the answer is yes, that could be an approach, but it needs to be developed in the middle of the society rather than being imposed from the top.
Yeah, and that's very true. Let's not forget that Facebook, for instance, has already introduced this tagging system. When a post becomes viral and the underlying information has been identified by fact checkers as false, well, Facebook alert the users and in particular encourage not to further share that particular information. Now, is it clear we cannot leave Facebook be the only judge of this type of warnings and the only actor to act? So, to underline twice what Lutz just said, the importance to develop the antibodies within the civil society and to have a system that tags or kind of signal to the users the trustworthiness of information sources on the basis of criteria that are, first of all, reflecting the transparency of the sources. That is the main thing. The processes of good journalism should be translated into signals that enable the users to understand how transparent is the source of information that is accessing through internet. And then also other signals can be taken into account, like the recurrence of disinformation in certain websites can be a useful additional element. So the elaboration of trustworthiness indicators is one of the points that is in the code of practice that needs still to be developed in cooperation with the media sector. There are independent activities and initiatives like NewsGuard from the United States that has been now importing its own model of source identification and classification in Europe in 4 European countries. It operates right now in the UK, Germany, France, and Italy, but it's planning to expand further. And we are providing, of course, hosting services through a project which is called SOMA to this type of services, but we would like to develop in a competitive manner. So we do not need to have one, but several sources for identification of information sources and qualification that the users can finally compare and make it on her mind on his own.
Thank you so much, Lutz and Paolo, and that actually gave already a bit of an answer to one question that we had, I believe, from most of it. What can be the role of institutions without becoming paternalistic? I was referring to one of the questions I was seeing on the screen, which was about the limits of action by the European institutions and where our action could be perceived to be paternalistic. The answers by both Lutz and Paolo, in a way, already answer this question quite a bit. The attitude is not becoming a ministry of truth at European level. It is to engage with actors at national level in the industry and not to create single points of determination of what is acceptable, what is truthful, but facilitating a dynamic system. From the room now, you had already asked for the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Andrea Glorioso from DG Connect. First of all, thank you very much for an extremely interesting and content-rich presentation. In a couple of hours, I learned more about what we do on disinformation that in many months I've been trying to read about this stuff. a comment which really tries to be constructive. I read the documents, I listened to you. I lived in the U.S. I was living in the U.S. during the the 2016 electoral campaign. So I had kind of a privileged, between quotes, view of what was going on. And what struck me, and what I think really led a lot of commentators and analysts misunderstand what was going on, was two dimensions of the reasons why what happened there. One was about emotions. And the fact that a larger, and now we have a lot of research about it, that clearly shows that one of the reasons why those elections went the way it went is because Trump triggered an emotional reaction that make America great again. And why is this important? Because a lot of what I'm seeing, I'm listening to, I'm seeing, is about rational responses to the problem. Let's give more sources, let's give fact checkers, let's educate people. All of this is great and it's necessary. But I'm a bit afraid that we are forgetting that people react emotionally. So which kind of emotional story should we tell about our own countries and the European Union and what we do? Would that help in countering the kind of attacks and dynamics that we see? And the second point, again, what I saw in the US, and we have a lot of research now about it, is pretty simple. It's about the socioeconomic security of people. People who are in weak socioeconomic situations tend to react more easily to populism and to manipulation because they're afraid, fundamentally. When we're all human beings and all of us react in this way, and when we're afraid, we tend to want protection. We tend to want the strong leaders and so on and so forth. So to what extent are we integrating, or could we integrate in the actions on disinformation, against disinformation actually, could we integrate this, in my view, very important socioeconomic dimension? I understand this is not perhaps your main cup of tea, but it would be interesting to understand to what extent in your discussions or in the discussion that have taken place, these two elements have been taken into account, considered, and what was the conclusion of those discussions?
Perhaps before passing the floor to Paolo and Lutz on this, and there is a question as well from the internet on cooperation with the United States previously and what is going on now with a view to 2020 that Lutz perhaps will want to address related to your question. But we have, as a European Union, my Director General, DG Home, so security, in other contexts, developed a very committed, meaningful action to produce, to support the development, to support counter narratives, counter stories, the other side to come to those who need to listen to it. We have done it regarding, for instance, radicalization of youth. And that is not the preparation of propaganda by the European institutions, is basically talking to the mother of a kid who went to Syria and giving her the microphone and the necessary support for her to give the other side of things. But that is, we are not playing that fiddle in this game. We are not in an exercise of counter-propaganda. We are not developing an alternative narrative as regards disinformation targeting elections. It is a conscious and deliberate choice. It's not that this cannot be done. It's simply that the option, the political option, I totally subscribe to it, and I believe my colleagues do as well, was that the essence should be trust. If we start to enter the game of producing, combating disinformation with our own view of things, this is probably not going to help with the trust equation, and therefore we focus the efforts of counter-narrative where counter-narrative is essential, meaning making sure that someone that is at risk of joining a terrorist group understand what this means actually and what they are likely to find out there. That is done by our member states. We have created something called the European Security Strategic Communication Network. It is done, but we don't do it in this context. But Paolo, please.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, the emotions are the driver of disinformation. Disinformation proliferates because it's able to trigger reactions in people by leveraging on very deep human sentiment. So you look at issues that are either divisive or producing or creating fears, anxiety. There is also another question I hear from internet. What is the most sensitive topic in your opinion? Health, politics, etc. Well, that is linked to that. Yeah. Politics, it is made of themes. And themes can be themes that divide or make people converge. There are certain topics that divide. You see it nowadays in the areas of immigration, and more in the area of climate change. There are themes that create fears in people. Everybody's fearful for his own health. So those are the areas where disinformation can actually infiltrate and proliferate. So that is linked to your question about emotions. Then there are politicians, and politicians that are very good in understanding how anxiety and fear can be used in order to acquire consensus by exactly eating into this middle ground I was mentioning before, where people are the most exposed to emotional reactions and at the same time the most prone to believe narratives that make them believe that there is a solution, an easy solution down the road, whereas the solution are not always very easy, right? So the information is the politics of emotions, in a way.
We have some final 5 minutes, so I would suggest that we would end with one intervention from each of you on the general subject that is coming from several of the questions that we have seen. There are a number of questions addressing cooperation with Arabic countries, with the United States, and one particular question addressing how our own member states have been responding and how we are able to, what is the success in bringing them to play in a coherent way on this. I would therefore ask, perhaps starting with Lutz, on the international cooperation. I refer that nowadays there are very few countries that are exactly like our own member states. We have to engage with many countries with which we have sincere and sometimes severe disagreements. But we have a dialogue going on with Saudi Arabia, including on those issues. Meetings do take place. We discuss those issues. With the United States on the 26th of this month, all of us are going to be in a meeting specifically on elections, discussing with our colleagues from the United States for 7 hours these issues. I believe Lutz is going to the US next week to talk about these things. So a lot is going on. So perhaps starting by Lutz, and then Harry focusing perhaps more on how effective he has been on bringing our member states to sing in a perfect choir, and then to our host Paolo, the last intervention on all of this. Lutz.
Good. Let me try to summarize. I'm sure there are plenty of questions also here in the room, and this issue will follow us for quite some time, so this is not the one and only moment when we will discuss it. On international cooperation, we need to think it kind of step by step. This is still a relatively new area, as paradox as it might sound. And even within the European Union, even between the member states, there are very different approaches, very different experience, very different setups. And we are focusing at the moment of, first of all, connecting this, building this. That's where we use this rapid alert system, which is on the one hand to alert each other if we see something, but at the same time also to build really a community where we can exchange kind of information around this. And where we have kind of very different authorities kind of in charge. The second thing is then to link to our international partners. First of all, those that are very much like-minded because they have similar approaches. like Canada, for example, others as well. Of course, the United States in that sense. We share information, we exchange experience. Jorge gave you the answer already. There is cooperation ongoing, but we come, of course, with sometimes a bit different angles to things, and we shouldn't be careful that we kind of lose ourselves in a broad kind of international approach, because it doesn't exist yet in any case. We think also we should look at international norms in this field, which is certainly a medium to long-term perspective, but an important one. Is this an issue that is also covered by international conventions? Is there work to be done? United Nations is looking into this. So this is, I would see it kind of as a step-by-step process where we are investing a lot. But as I said in the beginning, the G7 context for us is really the most promising one at the moment. In terms of international norms, by the way, I just wanted for you as reflection also to keep in mind, the more interfering we are, or the more robust kind of governments act in this area, of course, the bigger also the risk is that this is being misused, for restricting kind of freedom of speech. So again, we need to be very, very clear in how this is balanced. I wanted to come back to the question, okay, the gentleman has left, but about the socio-economic element. I would be very careful with kind of saying, okay, this is an economic issue and that's why people are vulnerable to disinformation. It's a little bit more complex, as we know from our own research or the data that we have at the moment. It's not if you're kind of socio-economically in a difficult situation that you're more vulnerable to disinformation. It can happen under certain circumstances, but it's a bit more complex in terms of the social fabric, let's say, where people are. And one of the big issues that we also need to address is, and that's where we have started, is to look at vulnerabilities in general. How, and that is related to the impact question that you asked, we need to understand very well where do we need to put the finger on. George said this can be the tipping points kind of part for elections, but this can be very specific groups. We talked about young people and old people. There is an extremely interesting element there that we always think the young people are so much in danger, but maybe they are not as much in danger as we think. But that's why we come back to all this. Lastly, maybe one word on this emotions questions, etc. Yes, we need to be also as European institutions, or kind of we, if I can do this a little bit broader, kind of out there. That's exactly where the term strategic communications comes into place. Not to leave the ground to disinformation. The best is, of course, to have alternative offers, that people can choose. The plurality is the key thing, and that's again where kind of the different policy approaches that we are pursuing in our respective fields of action are so complementary to the common aim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lutz. Before passing the floor to Harry for his final take on this point, I mean, on terrorism, we have been working now for 1.5 decades, on child pornography for 2 decades. What we have learned there is not directly transposable here, but there are a few things that from time to time it's important to recall. One of them is that in this country where we are, in the same part of the country actually, people submitted to the same internet, to the same social media, to the same satellite televisions in 2 different places. Let's say Mechelen and Vilvoorde or Dendermonde, have reacted in totally different ways. From Vilvoorde, there were 27 people went to Syria. From Dendermonde, there was 0. Right? From Mechelen, there was 0. From Antwerp, there were 98. If the internet was the driver for all of this, we would have seen 30 people going from Dendermonde and 65 people going from Mechelen. That didn't happen. Why is this important here? Because it is all that we are doing by, in cooperation with the media, by acting on the connect area of things is fundamental. but all that is happening in society out there is even more fundamental. This will be won in the families, in the cities, in the local communities, by developing the interhuman dynamics, the direct dynamics that can neutralize this type of action. But enough of me, Harry. How successful were you in cajoling member states into unity?
Well, it's nice of you. It's nice of you to put it in terms of success. Yeah. I would say that it's been a very long process, and it's a process that will continue because, as I said right at the start, this is an area which is extremely sensitive to the member states, and rightly so. And I mean, just to pick on some of the themes that have been raised already, we are, a union founded on law and values. We are not in the business of trying to organize elections so that people vote in the right way. We just want to make sure that people can vote and are not being coerced into voting in a particular way, or not being discouraged unnecessarily by the environment that they're voting in. So it's with that approach that we have been working very hard with the member states to build trust and to make sure that the member states do not see us as taking a paternalistic role in this, and which has been assisted, I would say, because the member states themselves are firstly have tremendous experience and tremendous capability in this area, and because the sort of terrain of organizing elections is so complicated, it would actually be foolish for us to try and sort of corral the member states in a particularly assertive way. So we've been basically letting the garden grow, letting the flowers grow in the garden, and hoping that that people will come along with us. And what we have seen over the last few years is, of course, because the member states have been motivated by a sense of genuine urgency, a genuine risk, a genuine problem, they've come along. And we have made tremendous progress in terms of the openness of the discussions that we're having and of the scope of the discussions that we're having. So whereas in the past we used to be sort of very, very strictly limited to those aspects of our own acquis that might have an impact on the administration of an election, member states are now willing to discuss, whilst reserving their freedom to act individually where independent action is necessary, such as I saw this on the slide there about Sweden taking action against Sputnik. But at other times, coming together and working either at European level or among smaller groups of member states in order to take particular actions to fix a particular problem. And that is the method by which we will continue. And I think that it's given the priority that the President-elect has given to democracy, I think it'll be the method that we'll be taking forward.
Thank you very much, Harry. Paolo. No. Paolo, okay. Please.
Okay. Just a very few words to conclude this conversation. My reflection here, after having heard the question in particular from the audience from the internet, is that it's only 1 year since the action plan was adopted. It's 1 year is a short period of time. We have now structures and approaches in place. We have strand of actions on which we agree and on which we are making progress. At the level of the Commission, I think we are managing to strengthen our strategic communications capabilities. And we are also being able to create, and DG Com, who unfortunately is not present today, has worked very hard in order to create a network that can join much better up the different DGs and the different policy DGs that are all directly or indirectly affected by disinformation, be it in the field of energy, exactly in the field of health or others, that they can actually work together to promote and to inoculate in the citizens the idea that Europe is for the good of everybody, before that somebody else start to spread the news that Europe is a failure. So thank you very much as well to DG.com, who is not present today. There are also structures that are getting that are being put in place between member states. The rapid alert system is an important platform that enables these exchanges. So the dots are getting connected at that level as well. We have a structured dialogue with the platforms, and the code of practice is the tool to pursue this structured dialogue with the platforms, which globally are more and more in the spotlight and held now accountable for the services that have been at the origin of the current interpretation of disinformation and are certainly now on the spotlight for providing responses to the damage that they have created. This is an issue that requires for sure a whole of government and a whole of society approach. So at the government level, we are working intensively also with the Council, and hopefully the Council conclusions of the upcoming conclusions of the Council, the General Affairs Council in December, will confirm that the track that we have been embarked upon, it is the right one and needs to be pursued. But it's also a whole of a society approach that is needed. And here there are many dots that really remains to be connected. It is the necessity to have a much stronger academic community and a stronger media sector working together and developing approaches to strengthen the role of watchdog that they need to exercise for our society to remain democratic. And there is a need to develop innovative and effective approach for educating people of all ages. And so they need to create communities of practitioners that operate in areas which are the most prone, because emotionally connected with possible negative reaction by the population. So those areas which are creating fears and division and anxiety, like the one that we have mentioned during this morning, practitioners from these worlds needs to be connected together and to develop alternative and innovative methods to bring critical spirit and critical thinking across our population. That will be, in my view, the ultimate and the most safe solution against disinformation, a critical audience.
Thank you very much to all of you.